So the title of the talk is, Do Minimally Verbal Individuals with Autism Have Hidden Cognitive Abilities? I first want to explain the title. There's some words. Minimally verbal means the severely autistic, those who do not speak or speak without functional communication, speech that is not useful for communication. And the second term is hidden abilities. What does it mean, hidden? In two ways. First, when you do the standard testing, the cognitive test, they do poorly, or floor performance, they cannot do it. Even if you do use pointing instead of speech, they typically do very poorly on that. But there is a second meaning, and the second meaning is what you see in everyday life. You see very often behavior that appears to be unintelligent. It appears to be like they don't understand what you are telling them, what you want them to do, or things like that. But on the other hand, there are some cases that they seem to show some very high cognition, or some understanding, surprising understanding. So we don't know. It's puzzling, paradoxical. That's from the behavior point of view. I'm going to tell you about two studies, one of them with the minimally verbal, with the severely autistic, that I'm interested in this population for a long time. One study we did a couple of years ago on skill learning in severely autistic, minimally verbal children aged 3 to 13. And the second study is ongoing. And we use eye tracking to uncover some skills that we cannot get in other ways. So first, a little introduction about the minimally verbal. They are about 30%. They remain minimally verbal when they grow up, even after years of intervention. Some call them the neglected end of the spectrum. There is a recent interest in them, but it's hard to do experiments and to do research with this population. And they are typically considered cognitively impaired. I got to be interested in that when I met, a long time ago, in around 2001 and 2002, a very interesting autistic person, minimally verbal, doesn't speak, from all the symptoms, severely autistic, but who wrote in his handwriting a book, wrote poems. And there was a question about it, but not about, but when I got to work with him, it was very clear that it's coming from him. And there are others from since then that other severely autistic that I'm in contact with, including Ido Kedar and Carly Fleischman, that you see here. And the first one was Tito Mukapadier. Well, oops. Oh, you see it here. Okay. So I'll show you a little bit, just a few seconds from Tito, writing in his own handwriting. What would have been if your mother wouldn't push you? And he writes, I would have been a vegetable. I would have been a vegetable. That's his own handwriting. His mother doesn't touch him. There's no question about this specific writing. You can argue about maybe other things he wrote that we didn't see, but there's no question he can. And he participated in experiments where he pointed. And we got interesting observation about his perception, but that's not interesting now. There is an interesting observation about the severely autistic, that some of their symptoms resemble what or seem to be related to what is called catatonia or catatonic symptoms. And here are some of the features that I find very strikingly fitting the severity, the difficulty in initiating and inhibition of action. So they find if you ask Tito to start pointing the experiment, he doesn't do it, and you start prompting, come on, and he start pointing, and then he finds it difficult to stop. So you stop the experiment as his hand continues. Reliance on physical or verbal prompts for functioning, I just said, you need to prompt them to start the action. Difficulty in crossing threshold, in completing movement. The hand is pointing and very difficult to commit. So if they point to somewhere, I saw it many times. Freezing during actions, repetitive and ritualistic behaviors, mutism. You wouldn't think that that's catatonia, but in the clinical, these are symptoms of catatonia. And one who was strongly promoting this idea was Lorna Wing, very famous autism research, and Amita Shah worked with her, and she's still writing papers about this. Okay, so we take this into a hypothesis that severe autism is characterized by what we call an output problem, a core action control deficit for voluntary behavior, not involuntary. Involuntary works fine, we go by the urges. By voluntary behavior is the problem. The result is a significant gap between the observed and actual cognition. So if this is the case, it calls for using involuntary measures or implicit measures, things like the involuntary movement of the eyes or something. So I'm going to tell you about two studies. One studied implicit learning, to get implicit measures of some cognitive skills of learning, and the second is involuntary eye movement. There's some prior research about the cognition, actually in very recent years. A lot of Tager-Flassberg work very recently, like last 5 years or 10 years. There are some studies with ERP, with eye tracking, and basically the emerging picture seems to be heterogeneity. We cannot really figure out. Some very, maybe few, some have some cognitive skill. The one popular attempt is called lexical semantic association. We show the frog and we say either frog or something else, and we see if we get a brain response for a mismatch. And we do something similar, but with eye tracking. Just to mention that in the lab we have these tools with eye tracking to get involuntary measures of the tiny eye movements, even during fixation, that we can detect in passive viewing a lot of things like contrast sensitivity, perceptual anticipation, and then familiarity to use in concealed information tests and so on, just to show you what we know how to do. So first is very briefly, the skill learning study that is work by Gili Katzneve, and it will be presented in a poster, 403, so you can get more details. And the idea is that is this. So we were wondering why typically they have problem learning skills, like daily skills. You know, to learn, to dress up, things like that. And we were wondering, everybody was wondering, is there a very fundamental problem with skill learning? And we noted that the common practice is to use long and repetitive learning sessions, and we know that they have deficiency in attention, and they have sometimes lower arousal. We try to optimize the condition for skill learning. I'll show you what we do. So this is that's all you need to do. You see something highlighted, you press the button. Okay, that's very simple. And this is like a random sequence. You do it for 4 minutes. Then come the next day, like 10 days like that, every day 4 minutes. 4 minutes, it's 3 times or 3 times 1 minute, something like that. So even the most severe autistic can do that, typically. Not all, but most of them can do that. Okay, and we also use vestibular stimulation to optimize their arousal. Very turned out to be a very important thing. So here's the result. So we measured the reaction time. The typicals are here in green and blue. There are some with and without. Sorry, we also had a group of ADHD. It's less important here. And what we see is the days on the x-axis, the reaction time, median reaction time on the y-axis, and we see the improvement. The gain of the improvement seemed to be similar, but importantly, when we do the vestibular simulation, we really get gains that are similar. I don't know if you see the cursor there. You don't. Okay, in the cyan, you see the vestibular, and the gain of the learning, what the improvement in time is the same as control. But they are much slower. In any case, we know that they can do this learning. It's implicit. You don't know that you learn a sequence, and they actually learn the sequence. So to conclude this study, minimal verbal children with ASD can acquire procedural skill with few short training sessions spread over weeks and with a similar time course as non-ASD control, despite slower performance. And vestibular simulation improves significantly, strongly, skill learning in minimal verbal children with ASD. This is poster 403. Okay, now I move to the second. This is an ongoing effort funded by the Simons Foundation to use eye tracking, to use involuntary or instinctive eye movements to uncover cognitive skill. We start with, this is a work by Karen Alert. This is her PhD work, and together in collaboration with Niva Scheffer-Kaufman from the Clalit Health Services. And I'll show you straight the paradigm. So let's see if it works. So actually you see here a bubble that shows where the eyes of one observer is going. And you see a word. In here it was in Hebrew, but I'll show in an English example. You see a word and you need to go to the correct picture that is associated with the word. If you try to do it, it's very easy. Right? It's very, very easy. After you get the idea, it's almost an instinct to go. That's the end, 36 seconds. And, okay. So how do we plot the data? We sort the trials according to the movement to left, movement to right. In this example, this is one minimally verbal individual. These are all adults, minimally verbal with less than 30 communicative words, or even less. Many of them do not speak at all. His eyes move to the right in red when the correct picture was on the right, and moved to the left in blue when the correct picture was on the left, and he knew what he was doing, for sure. On the right here, we see an example of someone who either was not attending or didn't know what's the connection between, or didn't know how to read. Because, you know, all these people, all these young adults, teenagers, nobody really knows if they can read, or most of them. We're not certain. Okay, so here's results of 18. We already tested 25. 19 of them showed significant, clear evidence for reading and associating the text to the word. So this is the group average on the right, and these are some controls on the left. And we can also estimate the percentage, correct? But tracking the position of the eyes over time, when you get to a certain point, they start moving like the controls after a quarter of a second, and they go to the correct time, and they typically do between, these are those who do well, up to 100% correct, from 70-something% correct, and even control makes some mistakes. Maybe they blink at a time. Here's the critical point. You do the same experiment by pointing. You have these cards, you read a word, you point. Do the same with pointing. What do we expect? well, if they can read and they point correctly, then we don't need all these involuntary measures. But it turned out that the eye gaze is by far better than pointing. Pointing is close to chance level. Here's a scatter plot. So on the left, this is a scatter plot. On the x-axis, we have the correct pointing percentage. On the right axis, we have the eye gaze performance. Eye gaze is high, is above 80%. And the pointing is around 60, 55%, close to chance level. This is a very important point because when we try to interpret tests of severely autistic, we need to know that they might not reflect the actual skills or cognition that they do have. So we do the same with hearing, and we get not as good results. So instead of reading the word apple, you hear apple, and the eyes goes, and all computerized, of course, and it's the same effect, but actually not as good as the reading. So how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So here's some consideration that we think about it. First, why the eyes? I mean, this is a motor thing. The pointing is a motor thing. Why the eyes? So we know that the eye gaze is in our experiments could be partially involuntary, examined in a restricted space. We know that the eyes are the last to survive brain damage, like in ALS or locked-in syndrome. So there's something where they are maybe close to the center that produced the command to move. For some reason, they have a better relation to the actual decision made by the observer. Pointing is a more complex operation in external space, feedback, and so on. That could be the explanation. The second question always asked, is our sample representative? We have volunteers. Most volunteers are from families that the parents think that the children have high cognition, and they have this, and some of them actually learn how to type. So this is not a representative. Could be the case, but we don't think so, because recently we tested those that were not typing at all, and the parents were really didn't have a clue what their cognition was. And actually we have example of some children that the parents thought that they could not, no way they can read, and it turned out that one of them was the best. Here's the point I want to make, the final point. Is it lack of development or abnormal operation? Of course, the development is not proper, but I want to argue that severe autism, at least partially, does not reflect a lack of development of brain mechanism, but a severe disruption in their operation. So it's different. If I didn't develop the Chinese language, there's no way I'm going to read Chinese. I never learned Chinese. I was never exposed to Chinese. But no, in their case, it's different. Something did develop here, and for some reason it's not operational, but in some cases it is. You can uncover it in some way, so it gives some hope. What next? We hope to investigate young children and investigate higher cognition. So remember, this is not really high cognition to associate apple to a picture of an apple, but and we really want to characterize the problem. Where is the disconnection? Why can't they really show their cognition? To summarize this part, we developed a novel, what we call the cued looking paradigm for assessing reading and lexical semantic processing in minimal verbal teenagers and young adults. Cued looking is based on instinctive and possibly involuntary eye lateralization, eye movement. 19 of 25 at this time did show significant correct lateralization of the eyes, correct movement of the eyes, most of them with poor pointing. These data reveal a hidden reading skill, hidden in the sense that you don't get it with pointing, and you don't get it in any other ways. 19 of 25 is 75%, but we think that some of those who failed actually could do better in some of the time. We also had 10 more attempts which we couldn't really track the eyes. Poor eye tracking, we have no data, so we don't know about it. Overall, we tested like 35. Literacy is not high cognition, but it does demonstrate a dramatic gap between the observed via pointing and actual skill. More research is needed to probe higher cognition. I want to final conclusion that in the severely autistic, we did 2 studies of implicit measures. So explicit or voluntary behavior is impaired and could be misleading, and implicit or involuntary behavior could uncover hidden skills. Thank you.